Good afternoon, I'm Al Kresta. In the last few centuries of Catholic history, there are fewer stranger accounts than that of Edgardo Mortara, a Jewish boy who was allegedly kidnapped by the Vatican and later became a priest. Now, this, if you haven't heard of this case, don't worry about it. It's a case that was extraordinarily popular in the 19th century and in the second half of the 19th century, and it was a cause célèbre. In fact, it has remained controversial, and in fact, there are those who recently have used the Mortara case as the primary objection to the beatification of Pope Pius IX. That's almost a century and a half after the case. Roy Schoeman is my guest. And Roy, you know from his outstanding book, Salvation is from the Jews. He's also edited Honey from the Rock, 16 Jews Find the Sweetness of Christ. He has now contributed a foreword to a new volume, Kidnapped by the Vatican, ? The Unpublished Memoirs of Edgardo Mortara. And it's great to have you with me, Roy. Thanks.
Great to be back. Thanks a lot for having me.
This is a very strange case, and I think most Catholics probably haven't heard of it at all. So I'm going to ask you, don't assume we know anything, all right?
Okay.
What happened?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say it was actually not an unusual case at the time. It happened quite frequently, so much so that some laws were put in place to try to minimize how much it happened. But the case itself is the following. A Jewish boy was born to a Jewish family in Bologna in 1851. At the time, Bologna was one of the papal states. The Pope was the temporal ruler, the king of a kingdom of papal states in those days, which made up, my guess is maybe about 25% or 30% of what is now Italy. What's now Italy was a conglomeration of independent city-states, some of which were duchies, some of which were kingdoms, and a number of which belonged to the papal states under the Pope as ruler. And Bologna was one of those. The infant Edgardo in 1851 fell very ill. The doctors actually had given up hope for his survival. He had a Catholic nursemaid, despite, of course, being in a Jewish family. And this Catholic nursemaid, when the infant was on the point of death, surreptitiously baptized him in order to look after the welfare of the infant child's soul, assuming that he would die any moment. The child miraculously recovered. And then when he was 6 years old, the Catholic nursemaid mentioned what she had done to a friend of hers. The friend told her she had to tell her priest. The priest said, you have to report it to the authorities. And she ended up reporting it to the authorities, and it went all the way up to Pius IX, who was both the Pope and the ruler of the Papal States at the time. And by law in the Papal States at the time, a Catholic child had to be given a Catholic education. And so when the Jewish family refused to give the child a Catholic education, Pope Pius IX himself actually ordered the child to be removed from the care of his family and taken to Rome. He was put in what was called the House of Catechumens, which was a facility for mostly Jews who are on their way to becoming Catholics. And he was raised there as a kind of ward of Pope Pius IX. So that's the outlines of the case.
Obviously, today, in 21st century America, most people would jump and say, oh, wait a minute. He, without the consent of the parents, the Pope just ripped that child away from his home. Why did the Catholic Church think that was vital?
Well, I think it's a little bit hypocritical. I agree with you completely that that's the view that most people would have today. And I will interject the fact that Steven Spielberg is actually in the process of making a movie on the Edgardo Mortara case.
Really?
So it's still used as an opportunity to attack the Catholic Church.
Right.
But the reason I think it's a little hypocritical is that even today, the state feels it has the right to remove a child from its family in order to safeguard its physical welfare. And it happens all the time. If parents are judged unfit,
Right.
if there's child abuse going on. I actually know of a case where it was because of exposure to secondhand smoke. The parents refused to stop smoking in the house, and the DSS came and removed the child from his parents. The parents don't make the child wear a helmet when bicycling. And I know a case where the DSS threatened to remove the child if the mother continued to let her children ride bicycles without helmets. So we don't contest the fact, maybe we should, but we don't contest the fact that to look after the physical welfare of a child, the state has the right, if necessary, to remove the child from the care of his parents. Mm-hmm. And if we are, in fact, immortal souls that live for all eternity, and basically, if the Catholic faith is true,
right,
if the state has the right to do that for the physical welfare of a child,
how much more so? Mm-hmm.
How much more so for the eternal welfare of a child? And Pope Pius IX did not assert this right over non-Catholics, but as the Vicar of Christ on earth, he saw it as his responsibility to look after the souls placed in his care, and this was a Catholic soul, even though the family didn't wish it.
Right. Was this explained to the family? Could the family have said, okay, we'll allow the child to be raised a Catholic? Could that have happened?
According to Mortara himself, and the book that I just wrote the foreword to and that just came out is actually composed primarily of Mortara's own memoirs. Mm-hmm. So it's his account of what happened. And according to him, he says that the Pope made that offer. In other words, that the Pope first tried to get the family to allow the child to be sent to a essentially Catholic boarding school, but the family refused.
Oh, okay. Do we know that he was actually baptized?
I believe we do. I believe we do. The servant girl testified a number of times and even gave details. And the formula, she didn't really understand much of what was going on, but she used a valid formula and valid matter and so forth.
Okay. So he was taken from the home when he was 6. He eventually becomes a priest. And I guess the first question I'd want to know is, he's written a memoir. Did he regret being taken from his, as an adult, did he regret being taken from his parents' home and raised as a Catholic?
Au contraire. I mean, he was incredibly effusive in praise and gratitude, both to the nursemaid who baptized him and to Pope Pius IX.
Yeah.
And to the point where at 7 years old, in other words, within a year of having been removed from his family, his mother came to try to, ask him, basically try to convince him to come back home. And this is a 7-year-old child speaking. He tells his mother, "I am a Christian. If you want me to come with you, there's only one way: be converted to."
So he's hardcore early on.
He is very hardcore. Here, let me read a couple of sentences where he describes himself at 6 years old when this happened. "How can I explain what I could call the explosion of Christian sentiment in my mind immediately after receiving the first ideas about the faith? No sooner was I instructed in the rudiments of the catechism than I adhered to the Catholic Church and to her head with a strength and a tenacity that nothing has been able to shake or conquer." There was clearly something deeply supernatural going on here.
Do you think that, I mean, you are a convert from Judaism and you understand that Christianity is Jewish. Would he have understood that?
Yeah, I think he did. I mean, you can't. By the way, he knew Hebrew fluently by the age of 4. Mm-hmm. He was both very well instructed in Judaism and also quite a prodigy. I don't know how to put it. There's no Judaism without the Jewish Messiah, without the expectation and knowledge of the coming of the Jewish Messiah. Mm-hmm. And there's no way of looking at Christianity without seeing that, in fact, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and therefore Christianity is the continuation of Judaism as it was reformed by the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah, and so that would have been presented to him fairly early on, do you think?
No, I don't think it was presented to him. I mean, if that 7-year-old comes up with a response like that to his mother, I think there was enough grace at work in him that he just saw it. I mean,
I got you.
Inescapable.
Yeah, okay. This created a great public outcry. Were the parents responsible for the public outcry, or were there outsiders who came in to make this a cause célèbre?
Yeah. The historical context of this event makes it incredibly interesting. This is the period when Italy was undergoing the Risorgimento, the conversion from a group of independent city-states into the Republic of Italy. It was actually, in part, an anti-clerical revolution. It was definitely a revolution. You had these partisans or revolutionaries under the lead of Mazzini and Garibaldi, who were basically leading revolts in the independent city-states of Italy. The biggest impediment to this unification of the Republic of Italy, this unification of the independent city-states, was the Papal States. And this was an opportunity to basically convince the world and convince the Italians of what an anachronism it was to have a theocracy, essentially, and to have the Pope a secular ruler, or excuse me, a temporal ruler. And so it was jumped on by all of the forces of the Risorgimento, as a huge battering ram against the Papal States, which was their biggest, roadblock to the unification of Italy. And it succeeded. Within 2 years after this case, the Papal States fell directly as a result of this case, because the Papal States didn't have much of an army of their own. They were being defended against the revolutionaries by French and Austrian forces. And the governments of France and Austria came down on the side of the Jewish family. Interesting.
Hold it there, Roy. We'll come back and continue conversation. My guest, Roy Schoeman, contributed the foreword to Kidnapped by the Vatican, the unpublished memoirs of Edgardo Mortara. We're going to continue on the other side of the break. I'm Al Kresta. Good afternoon. I'm Al Kresta. With me, Roy Schoeman. He's the editor, most recently read a foreword most recently for Kidnapped by the Vatican, the unpublished memoirs of Edgardo Mortara. Mortara was born into a Jewish family, but near death as a boy, very young boy, was secretly baptized by a Catholic, attendant, and once that was learned by the authorities of the Catholic Church, the law at the time required them to raise the child as a Catholic. And this, of course, came into conflict with his parents, who were Jews and did not intend to convert to Catholicism themselves. Hollywood director Steven Spielberg is currently making a movie around this, so you can expect in the next few years we're going to hear about this case, and it's still a sore point and was used to try to stop the beatification of Pope Pius IX. So this is Spielberg's use of this case part of a larger anti-Catholic moment in our history?
Well, that's a softball question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons this case is, to me, so interesting is because it is a collision point between the secular worldview and a religious worldview, particularly a Christian worldview. If, as we talked about earlier, if Christianity is true, if the Catholic faith is correct, then it actually was perhaps the right thing for Pius IX to do. I'm not going to argue that, but he certainly had grounds for believing it was his responsibility before God to do this. And if the Catholic faith is nonsense, then it was just an incredibly heavy-handed, insensitive, brutalization of a Jewish family. And we're seeing that same conflict. So it's sort of like never the twain shall meet. We're seeing that in our society. I mean, if God is for real, and if what God wants from humanity is for real, then there are very good reasons why two members of the same gender should not be joined in holy matrimony, so to speak. Whereas if it's all nonsense, then it's just persecution or oppression or something like that. So it's actually, we're seeing it, we're seeing the same thing play out today. And this is like an early, very, very crystallized example of it.
Now, let's make it clear. The church never supported forced abortion. Forced conversions, right? I mean,
that is absolutely, it's absolutely true. The church itself always condemned forced baptism, forced conversion.
Yeah, and so the only reason he was baptized is because his death was imminent, and that he had a Catholic nursemaid who thought she should do what she could do so that he would flourish for eternity.
Yeah, no, she was very devoted to him, as is frequently the case with nursemaids, and she loved the little boy. And, it pained her to think that his soul might be lost because, that's another factor in this case, that it is true that in the 19th century, the understanding of no salvation outside the church was a little bit different than it is today.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and I think that's important to keep in mind because they're operating there with a much stricter understanding, a much more formalistic understanding of what, both in its sacramental theology and its ecclesiology. No salvation outside the church. Here's a boy on the brink of death. Baptize him, and thereby ensure or make at least as many, give him as many opportunities as possible for eternal salvation.
Right, and without it, the understanding at the time was that he didn't have a chance. In the context of talking about this in the light of our current culture war, may I read a passage from what the adult Mortara wrote about this?
Please.
Remember, he's writing in the 1860s, but I think it's unbelievably relevant to 2017.
Please, go ahead.
So this is Mortara's defense of what Pius IX did. All of you who have condemned or now condemn Pius IX, reflect on what the rationalist governments and their leaders have done and are doing today in the name of progress and liberty. These representatives of the atheistic state, that is, the despotic, tyrannical, barbarous state, devise in their tumultuous meetings and then mercilessly apply perverse laws that attack the most sacred rights of conscience. Their teaching, a teaching that is anti-religious, is centralized and monopolized in pestilential professorships held by men without faith, without principles, and without morality. Parents are obliged to hand over the dear beloved souls of their sons to these demons in the flesh so that they might corrupt them and drag them with them into the abyss of hell.
Wow.
Otherwise, these sons will have no career, no civil rights, sometimes not even a roof over their heads. Do you see what he's doing?
Yeah, yeah.
He's comparing, he's saying,
yeah,
just look at what our secular governments are doing by forcing children into this educational system.
Right. We've got this is warfare. This is a form of cultural warfare. You're establishing your institutions, and you're trying to raise disciples up to your worldview. And don't forget that we have every bit of a right to do so as Catholics. And we, in fact, think that what you're doing is making children of the devil. We're interested in making children of God. So this was a very black and white situation that he was facing.
But black and white, that looks completely different if you buy into the truth of faith or not.
Yes.
That's,
yes.
I mean, because the black and white is on the opposite side if the Catholic Church is nonsense.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you think the Catholic Church is basically spouting a fantasy, then you would have the moral obligation to expose it, right? I mean, let's go. What I want to know is that did he continue to stay in touch with his family of origin?
He did, but it was he did, and he had a very loving relationship. But there were a couple of impediments. One was his family at times tried to kidnap him back.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, remember, he was like a pawn in the Risorgimento.
Mm-hmm.
He was a pawn in this struggle for the unification of Italy. So it wasn't his father. I don't think his father actually, on his own initiative, was behind the kidnapping plots.
Okay.
But the radicals co-opted his father or convinced him to aid them in the kidnapping plot. So the father actually went to Rome and pretended just to be visiting Edgardo, but was actually trying to kidnap him.
Mm-hmm.
And Edgardo ended up having to flee in disguise from Rome to avoid the kidnap attempts. So that obviously put a restriction on the interaction. And also the fact, I think, I don't want to say this is hilarious, but I do think it's funny. I mentioned his response to his mother when she came when he was 7, right, to bring him back. So let me read another passage, again, from his own words. One day, and this is again when he's 7 still, but he's writing it, of course, when he's about 30. One day, the young neophyte spoke to his mother with great conviction, mixed with filial affection and tenderness, about the sublime mysteries of the Catholic religion, about the most blessed Virgin Mary, the Holy Scapular. The mother, moved and softened, burst into tears and said, I too want the scapula of the Madonna. As soon as his father realized what was happening, he took his wife by the arm and abruptly separated her from the child. So the fact that he was kind of successfully evangelized his mother actually resulted in a restriction placed by the father on her visiting him.
After the loss of the Papal States, wasn't at least one of the church officials, Father Folletti, tried in court as it was a criminal case in Bologna?
Right. That is absolutely correct for his role in the abduction of Mortara.
Okay, so I mean the new authorities were going to continue to beat this thing even after they had the Papal States.
Well, as you said, Steven Spielberg's continuing to beat this thing to kind of, cast aspersions on the Catholic Church.
Yeah. What do we know about his priesthood, Father Mortara? How was he?
Well, he became. Needless to say, he was very fervent as a Catholic. He got special permission. He was ordained at little over 22, when by canon law you had to be 24. He was ordained as a priest of the canons, canons of the regular.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, a religious order, and he remained in that religious order all his life. He had to spend most of his life out of Italy because of all of the tension around, first the attempts to kidnap him, and then all the kind of attention that he drew. But he basically was a very passionate missionary and apologist, and spoke very beautifully and powerfully about the truth of the Catholic faith. And he lived relatively old age. He died in, I believe, 1940 in Belgium, where he was at a monastery of the order at the time.
How common was it for non-Catholic children to be baptized near death and then raised as Catholics in opposition to their parents' status?
It was not infrequent. It was not infrequent. I would say that, kind of guessing, every few years at least, in one of the Papal States or another, there was a case of a Jewish child who had been baptized being forcibly removed. So it was something very high in the awareness of the Jewish communities in the Papal States, which were really, generally speaking, they were in the ghettos. There was a kind of ever-present fear when the papal police would come into the ghetto, that they were coming in order to forcibly remove a child. Sometimes it was this kind of a situation where a nursemaid had baptized them. Sometimes it was children playing a game. There are some rather sad cases where, like a 6-year-old girl was playing with 6-year-old Catholic playmates who, as a game, baptized her.
Wow.
It was actually quite common.
Well, I'll tell you, this is a fascinating case, Roy, and when this Spielberg's movie is released, we'll talk again on this, okay?
Great. Thanks for this invitation.
Yeah. Roy Schoeman, a great job here writing the foreword. Kidnapped by the Vatican, the unpublished memoirs of a